Welcome to another episode of Gallagher's World. I'm Clay Vagoda, and Dennis, nice to see you after a little reprieve, and it's good to get back to this, and the timing is wonderful because I know that one of your favorite holidays is coming up, and that would be, of course, July 4th, Independence Day. And so I thought today would be a good time for us to discuss the Declaration of Independence and what Independence Day and the 4th of July really means for this country. So, Dennis, why don't you give us some background on the Declaration and what we're celebrating?
Well, I will, and having grown up in a household with Irish immigrants as grandparents, we were regaled regularly, without any prompting, about English injustice towards our own family. So every week was sort of a recollection of the grievances that our family had against the English over the centuries that they tried to dominate our people in the old country. And I can remember my grandfather, even when he took the test for the Moffat Railroad down where the Balfour is now, in that building, and he took the test and he got it for the railroad and he got 100%. And the bosses said, "Oh, that Irishman must have cheated. We're going to make him take the test again and we'll make sure he doesn't cheat." So he takes the test again and they watch him and he gets 100% again. Maybe we need this Irishman on the railroad after all. And then he would tell this story to me, and then he'd say, "Dennis, the Anglo-Saxons are always out there trying to get your job. They're always trying to cheat you out of your work. So you got to show up early, you got to work twice as hard." I still have this little tape of my grandfather Gallagher talking to me about the grievances that the English had against us. And then my mother's mother, also from Ireland, County Cork, she would talk about the English using children in the fields as target practice just to get ready because they knew the Irish were going to rebel. And so all these stories grew up with me. And so when I would think of the Declaration of Independence, I would remember not only my own family stories, but the grievances Americans had against King George III and the British and the way they ran the colonies of America. And thank God they mistreated George Washington so badly, who was in the British Army, that he rebelled and led the rebellion against them and did so well in countering their whole system. And we have to remember that 1/3 of the people were for the revolution. They were committed to forming a new government. 1/3 were with the English. They were British subjects. And they were with the English, and they did not want to leave. That's why Canada is in existence today, because all those Americans went north of the border and became solid British citizens and wanted to stay that way, the way they were. Then there was typical Americans, 1/3 that weren't quite sure, sort of like the angels in heaven. Who's going to win this battle between Lucifer and God? Remember, there were the angels who weren't quite sure. And God, in his infinite mercy, didn't have the desire to send them to hell forever, so he sent them to Ireland for all of eternity. But on the final day, they're going to have to go to hell because they decided not to go with Jesus. And that's sort of how I feel about those people who couldn't stand making a decision between George III and George Washington, who was our first president. And so the Declaration of Independence was to two sets of people. It was to those people who were not convinced yet that the revolution was good and we should break off from England. And then secondly, it was to the English people themselves, and the Spanish and the French, to make sure that they knew why we were breaking off and why it was important for them to join this wonderful endeavor, as the French did, of course, thank God for them, because we wouldn't have the Statue of Liberty in the New York Harbor today without that and without their help. They were of tremendous help in fighting the English. So anyway, that's why, for me, the Declaration of the Independence and reading it and rededicating yourself to it every year is important, because it's a listing of the grievances that we had. And the fact that against King George, who in his diary on July 4th, 1776, nothing much happened today. Little he knew. Too bad they didn't have instant telegraphic communication. And anyway, that's why to rededicate yourself to the principles of the Declaration is important. And when Tom Noel and I read the Declaration at the 4 Mile House this year on July 2nd, at the 4 Mile House, just before, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, just before the Glendale fireworks, that's what we're going to ask people to do, is to rededicate themselves. And I've even run off a copy here where you can sign your name to the Declaration, and then a little reminder of who gave you this.
So Dennis, before we get too far into this, will you give us a little history lesson and remind us of how the Declaration of Independence came to be?
Yes, the Declaration of Independence came to be during the Second Continental Congress, which was meeting in 1776 in Philadelphia at Independence Hall, which is now called Independence Hall. But you have to remember that this was the Second Continental Congress, but before that, there was a First Continental Congress called to try to figure out what to do with the problems they were having with England, many of which, the grievances, are listed in the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson and others, and trying to figure out what do we do about the problems with England. And so that is how we got the Declaration, because of the continued grievances and mistreatment by England and King George III of the American colonies, which were British subjects. And the First Continental Congress, even all of the states didn't make it. Georgia did not even send a delegation. So it was an incomplete Congress. So the Second Continental Congress had a lot of members who were not for breaking off from England and wanted the revolution, and they did not want that. So the founders said to themselves that we need an educational program to educate the members, not only of the assembly, but of the nation, as to why they should break off from England. And that was called the Declaration of Independence. And so they asked Benjamin Franklin to write the Declaration of Independence originally. And Franklin said he would help with the Declaration, but he wanted someone else to write the Declaration, a young Virginia lawyer whom a lot of people didn't know, but he said we needed Virginia, we needed the South, and even though Franklin was the oldest and the most influential and the second smartest at the convention, they asked Thomas Jefferson. So Ben Franklin and John Adams approached Jefferson and said, would you write the Declaration? Adams even said to Jefferson, you're a much better writer than any of us, and we want you to write. And Thomas Jefferson refused and said, no, I don't want to do it. So finally, after a period of time, because they realized that they needed Virginia to have sway and influence over the whole assembly, that Jefferson would write it, and that's how we got the Declaration as well written as it is, and the wonderful document that it is still applicable to today and to our individual lives and liberties.
So Dennis, it all comes down to politics, even the Declaration of Independence.
Most assuredly, because that's what the founders realized they needed. They had to build a coalition of southern and northern states to be able to unify and get everybody angry about the grievances that Thomas Jefferson selected to list among the many grievances that they had against the way King George III and England was running the colonies through their governors, and misappointments and misapplications and lost opportunities. And so that's how we got it, and thank goodness for it. I think it was a very special day when the Declaration was proclaimed, read, and verified by the Assembly and by the people, approved by a lot of the people, not everybody, because a lot of them were still good British subjects and wanted to be slaves to Mother England.
The thing to remember is that Thomas Jefferson was a radical.
Yes, Thomas Jefferson indeed was a radical. And thank goodness the Lord placed him in the Continental Congress at the time he did. He wrote the draft of the Declaration, and some parts of it were not liked by some of the members. For example, some of the founders panicked when they read the lines, "All men are created equal." A lot of those people who were at the Continental Congress did not believe that. Heaven help us, that and they did not want to talk about slavery and how do you count, what do you do about slavery in our country? And all the members were very nervous about this. But again, how politics comes forward. And when Franklin and Adams said, well, we need to revise this a little bit, and they did. They toned it down a little bit, but the one line that Jefferson refused to budge on was, all men are created equal. And of course today he would say all men and women are created equal. But that is the one line Jefferson refused to budge on, and thank goodness for it, because it gave the promise and the direction for the future that the whole nation took.
So Dennis, the term all men are created equal is a very nebulous term, given that the people who were being represented only were 3% of the people who lived in the colonies. They were white men over the age of 21 who owned property or possessions. So it wasn't as inclusive as we read it to be today, but it was still a very radical document for the time.
That's right. It really was a radical document. And even though it applied to only 3% of the total population of the colonies who were white, landowning, or wealthy, 21, all males, but it was a good start. It got us on our way. And we must remember, Clay, that the 13 colonies thought of themselves as 13 independent, almost nations, separate from each other. So that attitude had to be overcome by the politicians in the Continental Congress. And so again, the Declaration of Independence was to two audiences. Number one, to the people in the United States, especially the undecided, and then secondly, our European progenitors in England, and of course, the whole idea of slavery and indentured servitude has to be considered, because even the phrase, all men are created equal, flew in the face of indentured servitude in the North and slavery in the South. So the politicians had to handle it a very special way. And find a convincing argument that was conservative enough that would appeal to those who were in doubt about all men being created equal. And the way Jefferson and Adams and Franklin changed the phrase was that men receive their rights from a divine being, from the God the Father, not from the munificence of a government. So the fact that they were able to come up with that was a wonderful key that opened the lock to the heart of the mystery of why the Declaration was so successful.
Okay, so Dennis, you've mentioned a number of times that the Declaration of Independence is a listing of grievances. Without getting too deep into them, can you give me your top 4 or 5
Yes.
grievances that these apply to that are relevant today?
I think some of the things that distressed the people who lived in the colonies at the time of the Declaration were, number one, taxation without representation. The fact that King George and England thought they knew best which taxes should be levied on the citizens, the subjects in the United States, not a legislative assembly. And that was what the colonies were so upset about. And then the second thing that I think irritated the people the most was stationing of troops in houses in the towns. Whenever the British Army moved in, they would station a couple of soldiers. How'd you like to have a couple of English soldiers living in your home, wondering if they're going to molest and rape your daughters? And this is what was going on in the colonies at the time. This irritated people considerably. And then also the use of colonial appointees to harass the people out of their goods in store. And then also the no trial by jury, which most English subjects thought this was a right that they had, and yet that right was taken away by England and King George in the colonies, and it caused great distress, as it should have. And so those are top list of my grievances that I would pick on as the most egregious.
So Dennis, obviously the Declaration of Independence is a wonderful example of compromise in politics, of trying to get there to a certain place in pieces rather than trying to eat the elephant whole, as the saying goes. Can you talk some about that?
Yes, remembering that the Declaration of Independence was not only a message to the American colonists, it was also a message to possible allies who had monarchs in the chairs of their thrones in their capitals who would be of great service to us in the future, such as France and Spain. And so you'll notice in the Declaration, whilst Thomas Jefferson is very harsh on George III, he takes after him ad personam or ad hominem, not against the office of monarchy, because he knew he couldn't win that battle, firstly, but secondly, he might need some monarchs in the future to help us as we fight our battle for independence. And so when he says here in the Declaration, for example, he says, our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. He doesn't attack the institution of monarchy because he needed monarchs in the future to help with our independence. Very, very clever political thinking, and thank goodness they did it because we got our independence.
So Dennis, getting the Declaration passed was far from a given, and it was a very difficult process.
It was very difficult indeed. And the leap of faith that had to be made was that you had 13 independent different colonies who were very squeamish about this whole thing, and they all had to join together to form a new entity, which a lot of them were suspicious of too, a sort of a federal government that you could worry about taking rights. And it took a long time to get everybody on board, and they all had to sign, everybody had to sign from their state, a majority from their state, and it took a lot of dickering back and forth, and that's how they finally got it through.
So all 13 states had to sign.
Yes.
And all the members, you had to get a majority of the members of each individual state to get that state to
That's right.
be for the declaration.
And
So it's multi-levels to get it
That's
done.
right, and it took quite a while to get, and thank goodness it did, or we would not be the United States today. It took months for the Continental Congress to get a majority of the colonies on board. Lots of arguing back and
No,
forth.
not a majority of the
You had to
colonies.
get all 13.
Yeah, all right. A majority of the people in all 13 colonies.
Okay, all right, let's start again.
Go.
It took a long time for the Continental Congress to get all 13 colonies to agree on this. It was a major effort, but thank God for it, or we wouldn't be reading the Declaration, as I and Tom Noel will be doing this on Friday, the 2nd of July, at the 4 Mile House at 5 p.m., just before the Glendale fireworks. We will be reading the copies of the Declaration of Independence. I invite you to come and read your favorite section of the Declaration, and we hopefully everybody will rededicate themselves to the principles that are found in the Declaration of Independence. And I even leave a place for you to sign your name at the bottom, as though you were there at the Continental Congress and could sign your fortune and your good name to this document. And so that's what I offer for you this week, this weekend at the 4 Mile House on the 2nd of July, and hope that everybody comes and join us. There may be a small fee to get in, but it's well worth it. And you can rededicate yourselves to the Declaration, which, by the way, can be read any day of the year, not just on the 4th of July.
Well, Dennis, thank you for the history lesson today. And obviously, as we celebrate our Independence Day, it's an important one. That will do it for another episode of Gallagher's World. Dennis, I think our next time we're going to get together with you, we're going to be discussing the painting of icons that you have
Wonderful.
started to
Another
do.
fest that I look forward to sharing with the people, our window into the divine.
And with that, if you have any questions for Dennis or you comments, you can see on the screen ways to get a hold of us, and Dennis will apply himself to every one of your comments personally. So thanks for joining us this week, and Dennis, we'll see you after the 4th of July.
Okay, great.